Thank you so much. What a lovely welcome. I was cutting it fairly fine. I've come all the way from Fremantle, of course.
Yay!
Yeah. All the way from Fremantle.
All the way.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but what a lovely arrival. I'm actually known for arriving just on time. I'm rarely late, but I'm never early. Right, because life is pretty full. And of course, Saturday mornings, as many of you would know, is all about kids' swimming lessons and racing around and all that real life stuff. But I'm so chuffed to be invited down here, and it was great. What an arrival coming in. It's bustling with people. The place is looking fantastic. There's nowhere to park out the front. It's so busy. So that's a big well done to everyone who's organising this day. And obviously he's a very keen gardener who has opened his own garden many times and been involved in lots of community gardens. There really is nothing quite like an open day. It's great. So look, I've been asked to talk a little bit about the wonder of gardening and gardening in all sorts of ways, whether this is at home, whether this is in public spaces and community gardens like this. And when reflecting on how to go about giving such a talk, surrounded by what I was expecting would be very keen gardeners, I thought I would start really just by talking a little bit about how I fell in love with gardening and how my personal gardening journey started and then evolved over the years. Because all of us, stumble into the wonderful world of gardening in different ways. And now my gardening life is very public. It wasn't always. It started sort of a bit secretively, if you like. And let me explain. I first fell in love with gardening when I was a fairly young teenager. And growing up in Subiaco, living with my father, who was a very keen cook. He was a lawyer by profession, but a very keen cook and a very keen book collector. Now, those two hobbies of his, which were of far much greater interest to him than his legal profession was, he used to grumble about having to do that every single day, and really what he wanted to do was cook and collect books. Now he's retired, that's what he does, and travel as well. So it was the cooking part that first got me into gardening. One of my chores, if you like, at home was to look after Dad's very impressive potted herb collection. On the back deck of our little Subiaco family home was this old school herb collection, the type where there's the multi-tiered rack and each herb is planted individually in its own terracotta pot, all lined up very neatly. So my job was to keep those things not only alive, but actually thriving and also perpetuating them from season to season. So that meant propagating them, it meant dividing, taking cuttings, collecting seed, sometimes getting new seed in and keeping these things going. And this is back in the day where, when I say back in the day, this would have been sort of late 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And whilst no doubt at that point there were very good potting mixes about, I was under the tutorage of my father, who was a bit old school and always thought that soil should come from the garden and that every terracotta pot, to make sure that the plant would grow properly, needed other terracotta pots crushed up and put in the bottom. Do you remember that? Before, of course, we had the wonderful invention of structural potting mixes. We don't have to bother about that anymore. So the idea of cracking up and crushing up all the old broken terracotta pots, putting it in, filling it with garden soil, enriching and growing stuff is kind of how I got involved with it. And I just loved it, seeing those herbs grow and thrive and seeing Dad come home after work and go out to the back deck and cut the herbs he needed, bring it in and it would be in our meals. It was wonderfully satisfying to see that. So the next step for me, Dad could see there was an interest here. The next step for me was to set up my first no-dig veggie patch on the back lawn of that same home. I mentioned Dad was a book collector. So he, seeing this interest in gardening, wanted to kind of nurture him. He gave me a copy, a first edition copy of Esther Dean's No Dig Gardening. You would have seen that book, some of you. Esther Dean was the wonderful Australian woman who came up with the, or really I guess coined that term, no-dig gardening. No doubt that practice has been going on for many, many, many years, but she really coined it and documented it in this little manual. Lasagna gardening, another type, when you're laying different types of organic matter. So this to me was just a revelation. Fancy being able to sort of get all these materials, lawn clippings, leaves, straw, layer this up and grow stuff. And even better, apparently, you could smother lawn with it and turn lawn into veggies. So that's what we did. So Dad and I went down to the local garden centre. By this stage I was about 14. Down to the garden centre, got some sleepers, got a couple of bales of lucerne, some seeds, some mushroom compost, which was the go back then. I've since moved on from that, but that was the go back then. And also all the different types of organic matter from around the garden. And we made this no-dig garden. And I was absolutely fascinated to see how that simple, modest bunch of materials and a handful of seeds and some seedlings could be turned into the most productive patch. Only a couple of square metres, but something was well and truly ignited. And from that point, I started to slowly take over the rest of the lawn. And I started to colonise the fence with passion fruit, with climbing tomatoes, with beans. Pots started to be added to the collection. And it was really fantastic. Now, as you can imagine, I mentioned that I was a bit secretive in the early days of my gardening. As you can imagine, a kid who was 14, turning 15, about year 10 at school, gardening wasn't the coolest thing. So I was a closet gardener. I would garden at home, but I would not mention it or discuss it with my friends. But what it did do is it started to really influence my subject decision at school and led me into year 11 and 12 when I started to pick my own subjects, wanting to know more about the natural world, studying geography and biology. And I have no doubt about it, despite the fact that I've always had an interest in the natural world, growing up in Esperance as a boy and seeing some of the most marvellous coast and flora in the world, no doubt, around Esperance, as there are in many parts of the southwest and great southern and south coast. I've no doubt that sort of, provides fertile background to all of this, but it was my interest in gardening that helped me sort of decide what I wanted to study, even at high school. So Dad, once again, seeing all this, saw that I had an interest in gardening, and he brought out another couple of cracking books from his book collection. I'd already been given Esther Dean's No-Dig Gardening. The next two books, any idea what they may have been? Seminal pieces in Australian gardening contribution to the world. Spot on. Permaculture 1 and Permaculture 2. Permaculture 1, of course, being written by Bill Mollison and Dave Holmgren, and it was basically the subject of Dave Holmgren's environmental design honours work that he did in Tasmania with Bill Mollison as his supervisor, and Permaculture 2 was the next one that Mollison did largely by himself. Now these two first editions, and I was really learning something about my father here too. His main area of bookletting, by the way, is in Johnsonian literature. So to have these, kind of radical gardening books tucked away was quite a surprise to me. So these two books, particularly Permaculture 1, which is really much more than gardening, it is how we start to cultivate our cities, our suburbs and our towns using plants and animals through really thoughtful design to improve the sustainability and productivity where we live. Getting the idea that we need to move away from what is no doubt the most destructive process on the planet, which is large-scale agriculture. That is what has led to most of the land clearing and all of the follow-on land degradation processes as a result of that. We need to move away from that model and bring food production back into the cities and to the places where we live, where we can utilise the water we can capture, the water we can recycle, the organic matter that all of us produce as a waste every day, and all of these other resources that are all around us. And if we don't manage them properly and put them to productive use, what do they become? Wastes. So this was a penny dropping moment for me, where I started to say, you know what, gardening is a lot more than just converting a few square metres of wintergreen couch at the backyard into a productive patch. It's about rethinking all of the urban spaces around us. And living in Subiaco, as we were at that time, it was a fairly affluent suburb, and all I could see around with this new lens was underutilisation. And the fact that it was these lovely gardens, but there was things that weren't being put to proper use, and things that could be done better, and gardens that could be more productive and provide more habitat and help shade and shelter homes and living spaces better. And all of this started to become very much a fascination for me. So by this stage I was finishing up school, and it was time to start university. And I was really wanting to know whether I should do biology and environmental science or human and geography. So as most first year students do, I ended up doing a bit of all of that, including a bit of anthropology, a bit of English literature, and a little bit of music history. So what we call classic first year blues. But the most important thing I did alongside that is I started my own little gardening round. And this was the next big step for me. So I started a gardening round, and I was looking after gardens for people in and around those suburbs. So Nedlands, Dalkeith, Peppermint Grove, and my gardening business, as I called it back then, which was a pretty modest business as it was me in my first little Ford Escort 1.1 litre car with a few tools in the back and a thirst for gardening knowledge. Now, not only did that little part-time gardening round help put a little bit of cash in my pocket to get through the early years at university, but most importantly, it put me in contact with real gardeners. Because most of my clientele were older people living in those suburbs, and they'd been there for decades, had lovely old established gardens, but for one reason or another needed a bit of help. So for me, my job was normally seasonal pruning, it was mulching, it was lifting bulbs, it was doing all sorts of just real nuts and bolts gardening things. But the generosity of all of my gardening clients was fantastic, because I would listen. I would try and suggest some of the new ideas I was learning, particularly at that point. We're talking at this time, this would have been around about 94, 95. It's when water restrictions really started to be discussed, and we had challenges with water in Perth at that time. So the whole idea of using water better was very much the order of the day, growing awareness about organic gardening. So I felt I was able to contribute some of these ideas, but in return I was getting all of this wonderful knowledge, learning how to prune roses properly, learning how to, as I said, lift and divide bulbs, learning how to propagate things, learning how to make leaf mould, all of these great old practices which I was learning from my gardening elders. So whilst I was studying environmental science by that stage, whilst I was digesting any material I could around permaculture and organic gardening, I felt I was getting this hands-on apprenticeship as a gardener, working alongside older gardeners. And the other good thing about that job, of course, other than being a great chance to get knowledge, is I would get access to all these wonderful old plants. I'd go home with seeds and cuttings and bits and pieces. And at that stage I was ready to leave home and have my first student household, which I was, and this is another big step in this kind of journey. And that was to find a wonderful old rundown rental property in Cersei Circle in Dalkeith. Now, this garden became a very important garden for me. It's a house that I rented for nearly 7 years. And it's the garden that I lived in whilst I did my undergraduate studies, whilst I had got my first job at Murdoch Uni, which I'll talk about in relation to community gardens a little bit later. But it's also the first garden that I really restored, because it was an old home that had been built back in the early 50s, one of the first homes in Dalkeith, right next to the Dalkeith Village, for those who know that area, but back then it was the Dalkeith General Store. And it was a little modest bungalow that had the most marvellous garden all around it. Because as it turns out, it was one of the first homes built in that area, as I mentioned. It was a very low-cost suburb back then. It was sort of a post-World War II suburb that was opened up, and it was considered an affordable suburb. And the couple who bought it, I met the woman of the couple when I was living there. The husband has since passed away. This is many years later, of course. The story goes that they bought this place as a young married couple. It was the only bit of land that they could afford to buy in Perth. Isn't that priceless in circumstances of our people? Times have changed. And it was just Banksia woodland and Banksia Jarrah woodland back then. So they bought this property, first one in that little area, and built this modest home, and they set about building a garden together. That's what they did for their spare time, because any money they had they put into their house. So by the time I found this as a student rental all those decades later, what it was despite being very run down as a garden, if you look through that, there was a wonderful old glass house, there were aviaries, there were hen sheds, there was a workshop, there was the most magnificent trees, like beautiful old established English mulberries and brown turkey fig, all in much need of rejuvenation, but they were all there. So looking at that, and I first came across it by visiting friends who were there at the time, that they were ready to move on, I took the lease over. I could see that there was all of this wonderful stuff that could be fixed up, and I was fascinated by it. So I was gardening in this part-time gardening round, studying by this stage part-time, and the reason I went part-time was I wanted to spend a lot more time fixing up this old garden. Just a place that we were renting, but I could see the potential of fixing up this old place. So over the next 6 years I did this, and myself and my bachelor mates, there were up to 6 of us living there at different times. At one point we even managed to get an old Volkswagen Combi camper wagon, which we got, just the shell because the motor had long since gone, and towed it there and put it in the back and landscaped all around it and made it a 5th bedroom. And in fact at one point then we had woofers living in there as well. You know the term woofers, the willing workers on organic farms, very, very helpful. So we had woofers in there as well. But over several years, my mates and I set about fixing this old place up. And in the early days, it was like an archaeological dig. We'd go out and we'd start. I mean, the students have been renting this place. It was just in UWA. Students have been renting this place for years, so you can imagine the neglect. And as we would clear up the leaf litter and the mulch and what have you, we'd find these funny little flagstone pathways. So we'd gently start sort of scraping and digging, and then we'd find little header courses of rocks. Very kind of quaint, cute, clearly done by someone who's just doing it themselves. And it started to uncover this wonderful walkway through the garden. There were also all sorts of incredible succulents and seasonal bulbs, winter flowering bulbs, spring flowering bulbs coming up. I mean, it was such a rich and diverse garden, the fruit trees that I mentioned. Now, as it turns out, because we had this garden more or less 3 or 4 years, and we had started to add our own flavour to it, so we extended the original hen house and turned that into a series of rotational poultry bays all along the back fence with little internal fences, all for materials that we scavenged and salvaged from verge collections through Netherlands and very fertile picking grounds, mind you. And we had made all these sort of rotational poultry systems, and we'd introduced ducks, we brought in pigeon and quail into the aviaries. We had set up our own DIY composting toilet, highly illegal of course, but it worked just fine. And we salvaged an old rainwater tank and patched that up and installed that. And so we had this place really humming, and the neighbours who we befriended, again all elderly neighbours who'd been there for many years, initially they would have been highly suspicious of us, no doubt, because of the generations of students before us who would have done what students do, and we still did from time to time, but we did wholesome gardening on the back of that. They were very intrigued as they would hear the sound of poultry back in again, and we started to develop good relations, and we would then find scraps being thrown over the fence to our chooks. We'd send fruit the other way and we'd get jam back. It was this wonderful relationship beginning to being formed. But the one particular neighbour who could see what we're doing approached me and said, look, we know the lady who did all this back in the 50s and 60s, and she lives at a nursing home not too far from here. What do you think about bringing her back and seeing what's been done here? And of course, I thought this was just the most fantastic idea, because I was really curious to find more of a story, the background to all of these incredible items in this quarter-acre, Dalkeith home. So we met her, and it turns out that her husband was the president of the WA Cactus and Succulent Society. A volunteer position, of course, and he had that position for many years. Hence the old louver-style glass house that we'd inherited. And we'd found all the spare, the classic old ones with the cut glass and the metal frame and the little lead lugs that would hold it all together. And we found all the replacement glass that had been stashed down the side of the workshop and fixed that all up. And that explained, of course, not only the glass house, but also the incredible diversity of succulents. He was also fascinated in bulbs, and hence all the bulbs through there. So it's that kind of sense of history at that point that I just found so fascinating. Now, running alongside that, and by the time we had that garden more or less established and thriving, it was really like our home base. And even though we're renting it, we kind of felt it was ours. And what was interesting was the owners actually lived overseas. And it was destined for their youngest daughter as dowry when she would eventually marry. That's what we were told by the land managers who looked after on behalf of the owners. So they said, look, provided you pay your bills on time and you can be here, you're going to have a good run. So we really felt a sense of ownership, because we had just done so much to fix this wonderful old place up. So once that was up and running, I really felt that I was ready to start doing other garden projects and kind of network a bit more out there. I attended the permaculture conference that was held here back in 1996, and as part of that there was a permaculture design course that was run, and obviously by this stage I'd been meddling in permaculture, reading books, looking at videos, but I was really keen to sort of help get a better understanding of how permaculture worked, both at a national and also international sort of networking scale. So I, as I mentioned, I was part-time at that stage, gardening part-time as well, part-time at uni, and I decided to attend that conference and also do the permaculture design course. It meant that I had to get a bit more money together, because it wasn't cheap, particularly living on a student budget. So I decided I'd have to drop out of uni for a semester, up the gardening round hours to earn enough money to be able to do the permaculture design course, attend the conference, and think, okay, well, this is maybe a way to expand my horizons a little bit, to get out of my own quarter-acre rental garden and start to see, how else these ideas could have influence or have impact. And I remember going back around to the family home in Subi and telling Dad this was my plan, and he said, "That's a really bad idea." He said, "This gardening stuff's all well and good, but it won't get you anywhere." Exact words, which from time to time I do like to. And anyway, I said, well, look, I have to disagree. It's really what I want to do. So dropped out of uni, cranked up the gardening round, did my permaculture design course, which was just fantastic, and very fortunate that there were some amazing permaculture practitioners who came together to deliver that course as part of that conference. People like Julie Firth and Dave Coleman, and Ross Mars, really, really well-known local permaculture practitioners. And that really started to formalise my thinking that permaculture as an approach to urban design really, really has merit. And this is where my community gardening journey starts. Okay, so one of the field trips we went on as part of this part of the permaculture design course, which was a 2-week intensive course with about 25 people, was to East Perth City Farm, as it was called back then, run by Tom and Roseanne Scott. And this is the first community garden I'd been to. I would have been 20, 21 by that stage. Again, most of my gardening was in my own student rental and other people's gardens in the western suburbs. And I was just fascinated by this community garden. I'm sure all of you have been to City Farm. If you haven't, you must. and it was a really pioneering project there, obviously on highly contaminated land in that East Perth Claysbrook industrial area that's undergoing quite significant revitalisation. And to see what had been done, the way that food production was being incorporated into this old piece of rundown industrial land, to look at the strategies that were being used to deal with the bioremediation of the contaminated soils, was just fascinating. To see the social programs that were running out of there, employment programs, art programs, reach out programs, that was the moment for me where I really started to see that gardening and permaculture was more than just environmental sustainability, but there was an enormous social and ethical framework to be considered around all of this as well. The other site that we visited was the Murdoch University Environmental Technology Centre. Now, by this stage I'd actually left UWA and moved across to Murdoch, which is where I was studying environmental science part-time and where I dropped out of that particular semester, I should say, that semester. And I found that I'd been studying at Murdoch part-time for a couple of years and had no idea that there was this incredible 2-hectare research and demonstration site set up on permaculture principles, integrating a range of environmental technologies, early demonstration units of solar and wind, water harvesting, composting, toilets. All of this was on the back corner of campus, and I had no idea. And what was even more fascinating to me is that they'd applied the permaculture design principles to design this 2-hectare site, and they'd built most of it with volunteer, community garden volunteer labour. And they had a community garden group called Muppets, which stood for Murdoch University Permaculture and Environmental Technology Society. So visiting there on that site visit as part of the permaculture design course, I thought, well, this is going to bring me back to Murdoch. This is a good reason to re-enroll after this semester off. And I'll come and get involved here as a volunteer. So that's what I did. And I continued to live in my rental garden in Dalkeith with my mates and continued to garden that, but I was able to give up the part-time gardening round. I started as a volunteer, and within a month or two, because I was really putting my back into it, I was offered a part-time job to help run the student volunteers and the community volunteers and to coordinate all of the community gardening activity. And I did that for the next 5 years as I continued with my undergraduate studies part-time. And for me, running a community garden as it was, even though we had a number of layers to that site, including some quite serious research and development projects that involved postgrad students, PhD researchers, postdoctoral researchers, a lot of industry funding, and the focus was on identifying opportunities for small-scale and medium-scale environmental technologies in remote and regional communities. It was the permaculture and gardening activities that glued the whole thing together. And there was an amazing sense of purpose by the volunteers who gardened there. We would have busy bees, as I understand, happen here on a regular basis, and in fact happen at all community gardens. There were regular celebrations that we would hold on the solstices and the equinoxes to celebrate in a very pagan way, the importance of the seasons. And for me, that was just not only a wonderful opportunity to learn all those practical skills in that garden, but also what it's like working with people who are there, not because they're paid to be there, but they're there with a similar sense of purpose and connection. And really, that's what community gardens are all about. So, working there at Murdoch and involved in this community garden, and then looking at my own home garden, I got to a point where word started to get out about the fact that there was this group of bachelors living in Dalkeith who were living the good life. Yeah, the great old BBC classic, The Good Life, which funny enough was a favourite of mine back in the day. Or the repeats that I would have seen by the time that I was old enough to watch it. Word had got out about it. And so we had a call from the Post, which was our local newspaper, to come and do a little story with us. So we did, and by this stage, you know, we were certainly raising a few eyebrows up and down the street. We were right opposite Dalkeith Primary School. So, you know, a lot of Dalkeith parents coming by every day to pick up their kids. A pretty fancy suburb. And on our verge at number 63 Cersei Circle, we had a massive composting system set up where we had signs to the local lawnmower contractors where they could drop off their clippings in rotation. And we had this big, lovely sign with a, you know, all very positive. Warm fuzzy is the way to go when you're doing this stuff. You know, because people find it hard to get to a hard time. With a nice big bumblebee saying, you know, drop here please. So the composting system's on the verge. By that stage, the front yard we converted into a dry land native garden. There were some beautiful native specimens there already, which to me indicated that should be kept as a low water, low nutrient zone. We underplanted lots of local species, and we really focused all of the production in the backyard. So this post article, which ran, a week later, we had a call from the West Australian, who wanted to come and do an article, which ended up being a big double-page spread. Do you remember Earth 2000? Yeah. That lift out? That was that then became Habitat, I believe, after that. But this is showing you the period, Earth 2000, and because at this stage this was about 97, 98. There's a big lift out called Boys Grow Their Own Food, and obviously this was hitting a bit of a soft spot at the time. And a week after that, we had a call. Would you believe, of all programs, Channel 7 Today Tonight. Now, you know, if ever there was a program that I would run from 100 miles an hour, it would be that. But we thought, well, this is interesting. So Monica Koss, who's still the anchor, I believe, and was the sort of lead reporter back then, came and did a sit-down interview with me in the garden about what we're trying to do. And right up until the moment it ran, we were sure it was going to be an expose on something. And of course build that, you know, local boys grow food, but really what else goes on behind this fence? But it wasn't. It was an incredibly positive story. And then it was about a week or two after that, blow me down, the ABC rings. And I thought, well, now we're going somewhere. This is a bit more like it. One of the researchers from Gardening Australia rings and said that we've heard about your garden. Can we come and do a story with you, with Neville Passmore, who was the presenter. Remember Neville? Wonderful, wonderful man. Neville was still with Gardening Australia, and they thought he might like to come and do a story with us. So he came to do a bit of a recce, reconnaissance, as we call it. And there was so much there, he said, look, we're going to have to do a two-parter. Because this garden just goes on and on and on, as I was giving him the tour and all the things that were happening. And I should say, by this point, the garden was very well established. It was highly productive in fruits and vegetables. There were working examples of integrated poultry management, worm farms, small-scale aquaculture. We had, as I said, the DIY composting toilet, which managed to make its way onto national television. We had a DIY solar hot water system. So all of the little technologies that were being developed out at this Murdoch site that I was involved in, I was able to commandeer some of the prototypes and bring them back to Dalkeith. So we did the two-part story with Neville, which included serving up one of our chickens as a roasted meal to be shared with one of Neville's favourite recipes called Phasian chicken, which apparently is a Persian dish, with the chicken being glazed in pomegranate from Zone 3. Now, needless to say, no animals were harmed in the making of that TV program. It was all mocked up for TV, but we had the home-baked bread and we had the home-brew beer, and we were kind of laying on all the good life stuff. And then, blow me down, a week later, they gave me a buzz and said, do you want a job on the show? And of course that was totally out of left field. I never had any intention of getting into TV. You know, I was very happy to talk about gardening, and in my role at Murdoch, helping to run the Environmental Technology Centre, I was giving lots of site tours and conference presentations and these types of things, so I was happy enough to talk with a mouthful of marbles underwater. But I never had any intention of getting into media. So as it turns out, the timing was not good. I'd finally finished my undergraduate studies after nearly 6 years part-time whilst gardening and working at Murdoch and all the rest of it. And I'd made a commitment to go to Africa to do some volunteer work, to work on a small permaculture demonstration site in the northern part of Malawi. And that was through contacts that I'd made through that permaculture conference a few years earlier. So I did that. I took off travelling, and I thought, oh well, nothing gained, nothing lost. That was an interesting little, media flurry of my young life. Took off to Africa, spent a year on the road, 6 months travelling through Africa, 3 months on the project in Malawi, and then travelled right up into the Middle East. Spent some time in Israel on a kibbutz, doing some volunteer work there, looking at some of their irrigation techniques and their orchard management techniques, which are world leading. And then made my way back to this now very overgrown garden in Dalkeith, because without the head garden there, my housemates I still love dearly to this day. Weren't all that motivated, but it was still there. So moved back, and I kid you not, within a week or two of being back, the ABC rang again and said, "Oh look, are you back? Are you keen to take on a presenter role?" So anyway, I did, and that is, would you believe, 16 years ago now. So one of the things about Gardening Australia is that it is a solid performer. It does go year after year, and we're fortunate to have the most amazing, loyal viewer base, and no doubt many of you are just that, and we thank you for that. But it's been interesting, working as a TV presenter on Gardening Australia, and it is such a wonderful show in that we've got a great team of researchers and producers. We get to go out and meet other gardeners, and it's one of those programs that I think really epitomise what TV can do, in that it is positive, it's about knowledge sharing, it's about showcasing wonderful work that people are doing, and really, it's amazing how 1 year turns to the next. I'd always assumed I might have a couple of years working on Gardening Australia, but before you know it, as I said, 16 years goes by. Next year is the program's 30th anniversary. We're all getting together later this year to do a bit of an anniversary birthday shoot together, which is just amazing. And it's a program this year, as you would know, has gone to 1 hour for the first time in 29 years. And it is doing extremely well. The feedback on the 1 hour program is magnificent. And it looks like we'll be going for some time to come. But with the Gardening Australia sort of work, I guess, and getting out and about and being able to visit other gardens, and I just want to bring this back to community gardens before I wrap up and throw it open to some questions. The great thing about the show is it has meant that I've been able to get out and about and meet a lot of other gardeners and visit other gardening projects, both around WA and indeed around Australia. It's also meant that I've had an opportunity to be involved in designing community gardens. One of the favourites being the Onslow Community Garden. Has anybody been up to Onslow and seen the Onslow Community Garden?
Awesome, it's good to know they've got something going there.
Yeah, it's a wonderful garden, and that was set up back in 2007, 2008. It got underway, utilising a small piece of underutilised land on the corner of the Onslow school site, so right in the heart of town. And the feedback from the local community, or the input, had been that Onslow, this is before things really took off up there with the gas hub boom, but the feedback was that there was not really a community space that people felt they could use, for getting together and doing stuff that wasn't either fishing or going to the pub. So an amazing group of community volunteers got together, and they managed to get some funding and work with support of the Shire and the Education Department to get this corner lot set aside, and were invited to come up and work with the community over several years, which is what it takes to really create something, particularly in regional areas, to workshop together to look at a design that was going to work, that was going to meet their needs being, yes, food production being an important part of it, and demonstrating food production and the ability to grow fresh and healthy produce in remote areas where fresh produce can be difficult to get or expensive. but also having a space that could be for skill sharing around gardening, skill sharing around cooking. So the brief was to put a functioning outdoor kitchen into this space, and opportunities for healthy social networking, again, that was not necessary to do at a pub. So we worked together, we designed this space that had all these different elements and layers to it, and then what was felt really important was that it would actually have a lot of community involvement in building it, and in doing that ensuring there's a sense of ownership and participation to reduce the risk of vandalism and an expectation that stuff's just done for people. So we worked with them to identify a work program of the things that should be built by contractors, things like the outdoor kitchen and some of the key features that needed that level of professional delivery. But then the majority of the project could then be delivered by either volunteers or local work programs if it was planned and organised in a way where everything could be scheduled and there was a design to work to or staged properly. And so a couple of key local community volunteers worked as the local coordinators to that plan and to that schedule to deliver that community garden. And really it's more than a community garden, it's a park, it's civic space, but of course they still call it their community garden because it's got that lovely grassroots feel to it. So they had local Indigenous training programs, doing components of the work. TAFE students, as part of their skills development, would do parts of the work, and other parts were for volunteers to come and do the plantings and do the mulching and what have you. And that has now been up and running for nearly 10 years, and a fantastic example of what these spaces can be. Another one that I'm very proud to have been involved, which again has taken a bit of a different slant on things, is the Perth Cultural Centre and the Urban Orchard. Hopefully many of you have seen the Urban Orchard on the Rose Street car park. Now when then EPRA, now MRA, approached my design practice to be involved as the landscape architects for the rejuvenation of the Perth Cultural Centre, and this was back in 2008, 2009, when the state government was looking to really rejuvenate that space. The brief to us was, if we're going to spend a whole lot of money and a whole lot of effort fixing up the Perth Cultural Centre civic space, that area between the key cultural institutions, the area between the train station and Northbridge, which had was really run down, a lot of genuine concerns about safety. People would literally run from the train station into Northbridge and get through that space as quickly as they could. The brief was, if we're going to be fixing this place up, how can we do it that actually engages people? What can we put here that starts to make it a very different public space? And our immediate response was, you need to grow food in here. In addition to doing all of the sensible design-led initiatives, such as good passive surveillance, good security systems, rejuvenating the general civic areas so they look good and present well, thinking about incorporating events programming and all this other activation, more established activities to bring life into places. I said, why don't we also look at putting a community garden in there? A space where we can showcase urban food production as a key sustainability initiative, but also as a platform, if you like, a way of bringing in various volunteer and work programs into this space, and provide a sense of ownership over this area to a very different group that you would normally attract through running concerts and market days and all the other very cool things that happen there. And to absolute credit of EPRA, they said this is a fantastic idea. So we came up with the concept of the Urban Orchard, and then started to share that around as you do early in the design phase to get interest from the other key stakeholders. The feedback initially wasn't so crash hot. The feedback were things like, what? You're going to be bringing food growing into the city? People are just going to pick it all. Yep, they will. If they're hungry, they're going to pick it and they're going to eat it. That's a great, that's a good idea. And the other one was, well, you know, of course, all the things, how about rats and all the practical things. And you can work through these through good design and good management. Thankfully, absolute support by MRA to say, no, let's make this work. So lots of detail in the design, obviously, lots of considerations, understanding the structural capabilities of that rooftop. It's, you know, it's the top of a car park roof, so we're dealing with existing structural engineering constraints, existing drainage constraints. But that's all quite straightforward. You can design through those issues. The really exciting bit is, how do we make sure this works at a social level? How does it get maintained? How does it get utilised? How do you activate these spaces? And I flag this because it relates really to any community garden or any public space activation project. Anywhere you want to be growing food, on streetscapes, on verges, outside of your own fences. So we took a multi-layered approach. The first one, and we started this right back at the early concept design to make sure there's a sense of involvement and ownership over this stuff. The first thing we did is we went and saw our friends Tom and Roseanne at East Perth City Farm. The people that I'd met all those years ago, you know, when I visited my first community garden back in 1996. And we said, look, you guys have been doing the most amazing job of running work programs here at City Farm, of reaching out to the under-engaged, underemployed, youth predominantly in the city. What do you think about not only doing those activities in your hub there at Claysbrook and East Perth City Farm, but how about we work together to set up something where we can run these programs in the city? When you do projects in public spaces and you're doing commercial landscape projects, there's always an understanding that there's maintenance required and there's a maintenance budget that is prepared as part of the design. So you not only design it to a budget, but you also design it to the expected and available maintenance funds. And we said, wouldn't it be novel, rather than just assuming that the maintenance gets done by a commercial horticulture contractor, wouldn't it be novel if the money that's allocated for the maintenance of this being a public space could go to work training programs run through East Perth City Farm? And so there's actually meaningful work and a sustainable business model behind looking after the Perth Cultural Centre. Also recognising that the types of skills that you need to manage a community garden, to grow food in public spaces, aren't typical skills that you find amongst commercial horticultural maintenance companies. All of you involved in this place, there are quite unique skills around knowing how to tend to food plants, knowing when to harvest seed, how long you leave something in for, how to go about crop rotation. This is not standard horticultural maintenance in commercial landscapes where the focus may be on lawn mowing and garden bed management for amenity horticulture. These are unique skills, and that should be recognised and celebrated and supported. So the team at City Farm were super keen to be involved in this. So they were engaged to provide those services, and I'm really rapt that all these years on now, nearly 8 years since that project was finished and launched, they're still in there running and managing all of the food gardens there on the urban orchard, and they continually do a fantastic job. The other thing we wanted to do alongside that is provide an opportunity for community members to come and get their hands dirty in their Perth Cultural Centre as well. Okay, this is a civic space. It's owned by all West Australians as our major cultural hub in the city centre. So we're engaged to run quarterly busy bees. So we would do a harvest and planting day 4 times a year on the sort of seasonal turnover points, where we would open it up to volunteers to come. We do all the preparation, and we do it for a 2 or 3 hour exercise. And we would harvest all the leftover food, particularly when there's things like root crops that need some digging. By that stage, a lot of the tomatoes and all of the above ground stuff would have moved on. But we would harvest the remaining crops, prepare the soil, and then totally replant out the next season's crops. And we would typically get anywhere from 100 to 150 volunteers rolling up on a Sunday morning at 8 o'clock to be involved in this activity. And we did that for around 5 years as a way of really ensuring there's a sense of understanding and ownership over that space. What I'm really pleased to say is that there was minimal to no vandalism in the area. Despite all of the initial concerns that people were going to damage it, that hasn't been the case. My feeling about that is the fact that, one, you give people something that's beautiful and unique and interesting and open it up and provide some trust. You back that up with very practical strategies around good design and security and those types of things, but more importantly, you provide opportunities for people to actually get involved and have some sense of ownership over it, and all of these things de-risk that vandalism concern. And that really we shouldn't let those concerns about negative activities undermine the potential to do amazing stuff like that project and others. So the Perth Cultural Centre, I think now it's still the best example of urban food production in an inner city urban space, without doubt, in Australia. The Roma Street Parklands and some of the South Bank area in Brisbane's got some pretty cool stuff, but I still think as an overall site, the Perth Cultural Centre is right up there. And it certainly continues to get attention from around the world as well. There's been in many publications around, sort of activation of public spaces. But growing food, I think, is a key to that, and doing something that is so basic to all of us, but for some reason is still such a novelty to most people. And I think just wrapping up on that, the types of work that happens here at the Mantry Community Garden, and in fact in the community gardens all over Perth, regional WA and around Australia, is helping to demystify what it is all about growing food. About how accessible it can be, about how rewarding it can be, about how healthy it is to do so, not just physically and in terms of reduced environmental impact through local production and reduced food miles, but how socially restorative it is as well. And really that is to be celebrated. So there's a little bit of a story about where I fell into gardening, how I grew to love gardening, how gardening went from just an interest in gardening to clearly now what's going to be a lifelong career, but also how we need to be gardening not just at home, but we need to be gardening in community spaces too, and whether it's in community gardens like this, which are so incredibly important for all the reasons I've mentioned, or in other public spaces as well, we need to become a community of gardeners, quite simply, because when people garden, we tend to stop and think about where things come from. We tend to think about how connections between our activities work, whether it's about how things grow, how we use water, how we manage our waste. We start to identify those connections. And really, gardening is much more than just keeping the place tidy and making it look good. Real gardening is about making those connections, and not just the physical ones, but the social ones as well. Thanks very much. So I thought we could maybe open it up to a few questions, whether it's questions about what I've spoken about, or whether it's practical gardening questions.
I have a question. I brought 3 samples of shade cloth.
Great.
And I would like to know, because before the advice was to use 70% shade cloth. And then last year I learned that this new guidelines now. Can you just...
Sure. So the question is about shade cloth, and I'm assuming
for vegetables.
For vegetables, yeah. So the shade cloth that you want to be using over vegetables, should you choose to do so, is you want to be using what they call horticultural shade cloth, not regular heavy shade cloth, which is used for really providing decent shade to people. You want to be using horticultural shade cloth, which is typically between 30 to 40% shade, and also normally white in colour. so it stays cool. And you can buy it by the roll from most good garden centres or large hardware stores. You can order it online as well, but it's horticultural shade cloth, and it's 30 to 40%. You can get both. And why that's important is that at that light level of shade, it'll take out the sting of the sun, it'll prevent burning of sensitive plants and fruit, but you'll still get enough light through for the plants to be strong. If you're growing under heavier shade, even 70%, certainly 90%, your plants are going to be weak and leggy, and when they're weak and leggy, they're more prone to pest and disease attack, and also you're unlikely to get really good fruit development at that low light level as well. The heavier shade cloth is fine to be using as a windbreak material along fences.
They're different here, the percentage.
Yes.
One is lighter.
Yes, one is very much lighter, so that's
No,
obviously
this
lighter.
invisible shield or not?
Oh, look, that looks like it's probably around about 40%. That should be fine. These ones are heavier. Looks like you've got a 70 and a 90 there, just by eye. But there's three different grades of shade cloth there. Yeah, the heavier shade cloth is great for windbreaks, and that's really important to stop the hot drying wind until you can establish, vegetative windbreaks. But for shade, use horticultural shade cloth.
I've got a dwarf nectarine tree I've had for about 5 years. It's in the ground. After a couple of years it flowered. I got some beautiful fruit off it. Last year it flowered, didn't produce fruit. This year it's flowering again, and it looks like it may not be producing fruit again. Can you tell me why?
Okay, so do you know what variety of nectarine it is?
No.
Okay. So the question is, for those at the back, this gentleman has a dwarf nectarine, which has flowered and fruited well in the past. Last year flowered, no fruit. This year flowering is worried, no fruit as well. Of course, they're self-pollinating, so it's not a cross-pollination issue. The likelihood of lack of fruit development is either poor pollination, because even though they are self-pollinating, they still need a pollinating agent. But more likely is some stress factor has resulted in flower drop before pollination or fruit development. Now that can either be lack of moisture, it can be strong winds, or it can also be, in extreme cases, nutrition and lack of trace elements. But you would normally have seen that at the end of the previous season in stunted growth. So make sure there's enough protection around it from strong wind if that's an issue. Make sure it's plenty of compost around the base, then well mulched to keep the soil nice and cool, and then hopefully there's plenty of other flowering things in your garden that are bringing around pollinators. So
I've got apricots, and that's flowering.
And they're flowering and producing fruit. Okay.
And mango producing fruit.
So it's, normally peaches and nectarines are pretty reliable at setting fruit. So, and if it's done in the past, it's obviously a variety that does produce. It's not a row seedling prunus or something. So
I'm not a very good pruner, but
yeah. Well, with dwarf fruit trees, there is a myth that they don't need pruning. That's not true. They just need less pruning because there's less of them because they're smaller. Now, with the peaches and nectarines, they of course produce only off 1-year-old wood. But if you're getting flowers, then you've got flowering and therefore fruiting sites. So that's not the issue in your case. But worth keeping in mind, if you are growing different types of fruit trees, prunus in particular, is making sure that you're not only pruning to maintain shape and structure and general access to the tree, but you're pruning so you always have flowering and therefore fruiting wood on the tree as well.
thank you.
Can you reach nice, looks like a nice garden. What's your address?
Question back here?
Yes, please. Can I ask you, I've got a lime tree. It's in beautiful condition, millions of flowers. It's set, they're about this big, and then they all start to drop off.
Okay, what kind of lime is it and how big is it?
It's supposed to be a dwarf, it's this big.
Okay, is it a patio lime?
Yes.
One of the dwarf patio limes? Okay, so they are prolific in their flowering. They'll all develop into little fruit, but the plant can't sustain them. So they will self-abort, a lot of them. Okay, so that's not to be surprised about. Someone has mentioned strip them. They will do that by themselves. Yeah, they'll do that by themselves. But you won't lose all of them. Yeah. No. So provided it's well watered, well mulched, then it will it's in a protected spot and not having young fruit blown off through wind stress. Then you'll find they'll do that anyway, but you'll still get plenty.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, one here, then up the back next. Yeah. Okay. So the question was that I am often seen using rock dust, or you might hear me refer to it as rock minerals. Basically, the concept is you get a mineral product that has a diverse array of specifically selected rock types that contain a range of trace elements that you're after in garden soil. And so it's not just, the term rock dust is a bit misleading, because I have seen people literally selling bags of ground up dolerite, okay, which is, there's not much in there. Good rock mineral products are selected and contain anywhere from 8 up to 12 different rock types, including basalt, rock phosphate, magnesite, a whole range of different rock types, sulfur, that ground and then prilled into little pellets and inoculated with different types of microbial life forms, so mycorrhizal fungi, bacteria, protists, which are dormant when they're dry, and then when put into the garden soil or work through your compost, the microbes become active, and the different rock materials, and keeping in mind that the elements and the trace elements that are contained within these range of rock-based materials are only available to plants via mycorrhizal and other microbial interactions. So it's very, very slow release remineralisation of your soil, which is so incredibly important when you're gardening on coastal soils like we are here in Perth, which are basically quartz, and if you're near the coast, quartz and limestone. So very little minerals availability for plants, and of course for our diets. So that's why I do it. It's remineralising the soil, but it's small amounts regularly over time. And then what starts to happen is when you're introducing these trace elements into your gardening systems, and you're pruning and harvesting material and then composting it, you're starting to get that nutrient cycle happening. So it's moving away from just importing nutrients, using it, and then having those leave the system if you're carting all your green waste away, or or not, and rather than composting at home. But if you start to recycle all your materials, you sort of start to keep that, so you can apply less and less over time.
Has it got like trade name or something like that?
So there are various products available. I use rock minerals that are produced by a local manufacturer here called EcoGrowth. They've been around for many years. They put a lot of work into their R&D and the science behind their products, and they also do a lot of work with commercial growers, vineyards, orchards, and market gardens, where there's a lot of emphasis placed on return on investment from inputs. So you start to move away from some of the witch doctory type, products, and look at ones that actually do have proper, evidence-based support behind what they're doing. So, but there are many other good ones as well. That's just one that's local that I've worked with for many years. No, but other good garden centres. So the Waldex and the like will stock them.
Sorry, Josh, what was that one you said again?
It's products like EcoGrowth. Yeah. And they also do, by the way, a really good humus-based non-surfactant wetting agent, which is good as well. work. Yeah, you've got to be careful overdoing it with surfactant-based wetting agents. They can exacerbate non-wetting soils. A little bit's okay. They do a good sort of a humic acid-based one. I'm back. I wouldn't be pruning it right now. So the question was, this lady's got a triple grafted apple tree. You're best to prune it after it's fruited. So typically what we do with fruit trees these days is we'll do a certain level of summer pruning, or canopy management as it's called. So once it's fruited, you can cut back material that you would otherwise prune off in a heavy prune. And the reason you do that is to reduce the impact on the tree of doing a hard prune when it's dormant. The tree's better able to heal itself too, obviously, if it's done in the growth phase. Also, just by reducing the canopy of a tree at that point, or a vine, grapevines are the same, it means less water use, less fertiliser use, taking up less space. So it's quite a practical management strategy. But then there's still a role for a winter prune, because it's not until the plant's totally naked that you can really have a good look at its bones and decide what you might do in terms of a bit of restructuring. The only reason why you prune now, given that it's probably flowering now, and it'll be setting fruit now, so if you prune it now, you can put it into shock and it may drop flowers and even any young fruit. The only reason why you would prune it now is if there's any damage. So if you're seeing something's broken, you cut it off, because it just gives it a clean cut, reduces the chance of infection, or any other kind of mechanical issue, a rebad crossing or something you might cut out now, but otherwise wait until it's finished fruiting. Yes, so I mean, I'd be surprised if your olive's flowering now, is it? They don't normally flower until a little bit later.
Flowering.
Yours is flowering already, is it?
A lot of flowers.
Oh, okay. What variety? Yeah. So, general rule is don't prune fruit trees when they're flowering across the board. It can be hard with Eureka lemons because they seem to flower all the time. Try and do it in a quiet moment, but yeah, don't prune when flowering.
Avocado tree.
Yes.
I'm looking at planting some, and whether I've got to have an A and a B. I've been looking at it. Gwen and works in the A.
Yes.
But I'm looking for a B in a dwarf rootstock variety.
Okay. So the older varieties and the traditional varieties, yes, you need an A type and a B type to guarantee the appropriate cross-pollination, because the male and female flowers become active at different types of day. However, there are now new dwarf self-pollinating varieties as well. Yeah, so you have choice there. Now, in terms of selecting the best pollinator, the best thing to do is speak to your garden centre, and they can advise on what are the best A type and B types that are suitable for Perth and that may be available in a grafted form as well.
Josh, what's your opinion on copper sprays, considering our health?
Yeah. I would still use them selectively. It's best described as a low toxic spray, and a very effective fungicide. But like anything, there's so much that can be done to reduce the likelihood or the severity of the particular fungal disease you might be treating. Good pruning, good health, make sure there's plenty of sunlight, ventilation, reducing the canopy of the plant, so when it does come to do some targeted spray, you're using less of it, and sensible use. And I think that applies pretty much across the board.
We seem to have a spate of acacia dieback in the area.
Okay, acacia dieback, is it from pest attack, like galls? You're not talking about the Banksia through there? The Banksias, yeah. So I was going to say, yeah. That's also Banksia, yeah. That looks like Banksia menziesii. Look, Banksias are very finicky. They're highly susceptible to Phytophthora cinnamomi, or Jarrah dieback is the common name. And also given they're members of the Proteaceae family and they have proteoid roots, they're highly intolerant of phosphorus in fertiliser. So the reason for them dying off around you here could either be because of, one, root disturbance, so digging around if you're putting in fences or what have you. Or it could be from over-fertilising, so if you're fertilising garden beds that are alongside, that can cause them to put their feet up. Or you may well find that there's Phytophthora in the area, which is not uncommon. It's right through urban Perth as well as obviously many parts of our bushland. But unfortunately, Banksias are finicky, and particularly the Swan Coastal Plain ones, Grandis, Bentisi, Attenuata. So it could be any one of those, but I'm not surprised to see that happen. Wherever possible, where you do have existing Banksias in place, it's best to avoid cultivation around those areas. Really allocate those to your dry land native garden areas. Like I mentioned in my earlier story, the front yard of number 63 Cersei Circle, one of the reasons we said, right, this is going to be our dry land native garden where we'll introduce local native species only and mulch it, but mainly stay out of it, was the fact that we had a number of lovely, healthy species, including some great Banksias. So don't garden around them is the best advice.
The one behind you, is it dieback too?
Sorry, let's have a quick look.
Oh no, this one. This one is dieback? Yes, this one.
No, that's fire damage. So that's had a burn go through it. You can see all the burnt scarring. Yeah.
I just asked because on my veg there's eucalypt tree with dieback. Is it possible to
Okay, so
save
let's not confuse this term dieback. So you might be using it as a description. Dieback is a term in kind of in the gardening world is really a common name for Phytophthora, and often it's Phytophthora cinnamomai. Now, what you normally see there, and again, Phytophthora, which is a soil-borne fungus, it normally presents itself with the crown dying back first. So, Jarrah is one of the sort of key species in our forest systems that are prone to it, and so hence the name Jarrah dieback, but really affects many native and exotic species. It affects avocados, for example. It's a big issue in avocados. It affects macadamias and many other species as well. But normally you see it dying from the crown down because the roots get damaged and they can't send moisture up.
Similar to this.
Okay, so that's not dieback.
It's a different sport.
Okay, so what it could be, that's obviously physical
fire.
damage from a burn.
Yeah.
Elsewhere it could be canker, it could be physical damage, it may have been nicked or cut. And if you consider that a tree only actually has a fairly thin skin of living tissue, so on the outside you've got the bark, which might be smooth or corky depending on the species. Underneath that you've got cambium layers that produce the vascular bundles on the inside and produce the bark for the outside protection. Now, if that thin layer gets damaged, again, whether it's by insect activity, mechanical activity like someone whacking it, a bird, or fire, it causes a scar, and if it doesn't heal back up and callus over, it'll have an exposure through to the heartwood like you have there. So without seeing it, I can't tell you what it is, but that sounds like what's happened.
What could be a natural way of getting rid of aphids on rose bushes, etc.?
Okay. So the question was, what's a natural way to get rid of aphids, in this case on a rose bush? So first and foremost, what we're looking to do is create balanced, healthy garden ecosystems where we have a good mix between pests and predators. Things like the juvenile of lacewings, of hoverflies, of ladybirds, all predate on aphids. Okay. So unless you've got aphids in the garden, you won't have those beneficial insects. Okay. That's the first thing. And so the types of things you can do in your garden to make sure that you do have those beneficial insects, which then results in the likelihood of less pest outbreaks, is not only to have some of those pests as the food for the juveniles, but the adults are actually pollen and nectar feeders. So, because an insect have got 2 stages to their life cycle. So you need to make sure there's plenty of small flowering plants that are suitable for the adults of those particular beneficial predators. So it's things like any alliums, so flowering leeks or onions, lobelia, alyssum, flowering coriander, flowering parsley, flowering carrots. All of these small umbel type flowers are fantastic. I can see hoverflies hovering around in front of me here. So they're juveniles, they predate on aphids. So you want to be bringing those around. So that's the goal. Happiness, harmony, everything working. But of course, we never quite get that right all the time, particularly when we're gardening in a place with very poor soil and an extreme heat and a lack of water. Things get stressed, they get very vulnerable, things get out of whack, and that's where we can step in. So small amounts of aphids, best things to do is to go along and literally, it sounds silly, squirt them with a hose, knock them off. Get small populations early, smear them with your thumb. That can be just enough if you get in early to stop a population booming. Aphids clone themselves, so they can increase their population very, very quickly. So if you get in early, you can stop that. Then as a final step, if you're really noticing that some areas are heavily infested, you can use a certified organic spray. Something like a botanical oil is really good in that you'll smother them. The problem there is that you'll also smother any beneficial insects as well. So it's always good to have a look at the infestation, and sometimes you might be surprised with a magnifying glass. Not only will you see the aphids, but you'll often see a whole lot of mummified aphids, and you'll see these scary little creatures which are the juveniles of those beneficial predators that I mentioned that are there feasting as well. So any of the certified organic sprays, whether it's a botanical oil or whether it's a neem-based spray or even your own chili garlic spray or emulsion, will all knock off the beneficials as well as the pests. So.
I have a few pots of herbs, and I can go to bed one night and they look lovely. I come out next morning, caterpillars of them. What do I do? There's no sign of a caterpillar the night before.
Sure. So just for those at the back, the lady mentioned she has her herbs all planted out looking lovely and comes back and the caterpillars have got to them. First question, are you sure they're caterpillars? Have you seen them? Okay. Do you know what type of caterpillars they are? Okay, sure. Yeah, sure. So one option is physical protection. So something's coming in and dropping eggs on those, and if they're caterpillars, it's going to be a moth or a butterfly. So when the seedlings are young and vulnerable, where one evening or 2 evenings of attack will knock them off, you can get some insect exclusion fabric, which you can just pop over them for times of the year when those pests are about, and normally it's a fairly short window. Okay, so that's the, I guess, the safest and cleanest thing to do. The next thing you do is put on some sprays that can repel, and neem is a good one. Again, neem does 2 things. One, it acts as a deterrent. So when the moth is coming to lay, they have their olfactory or their nose sensors on their antenna. They pick up that something's not right, and they may go and lay somewhere else. And the other thing that it does is it's an appetite suppressant. So if you've got caterpillars feeding on material that has neem on it, it basically slows down their appetite. It also disrupts the molting cycle. So it has a number of modes of action, and you can get, and if used as a certified supplied product, i.e. it hasn't got other substances mixed with it, it's totally safe to use. So that's one option, but normally it's exclusion first, plant enough of them, and then if it's a breakout, there's a spray.
What do you think about slasher used to kill weeds as against the pesticides
The herbicide with glyphosate? Yeah. So, glyphosate, it's a problematic pesticide. It's clearly been way overused. It's been shown now quite clearly to be unsafe. Certainly unsafe at the volumes that it's used at. I think we're only beginning to see the beginning of the big pushback against it. you know, for me, weed management, we need to move away from the use of herbicides. I think there's a role for the selective, careful use of herbicides in bush regeneration activities, for example, where when going into bush regen areas and when the end game is to remove weeds and restore, you know, natural areas, often mechanical weeding, getting in there and doing it physically, causes more damage, more disturbance, and the weed problem can be worse. So there are selective areas where the very careful use of the right herbicide, I feel, has a role in when we look at the overall end game. What we need to move away from is the situation where we repeatedly use herbicides, and particularly ones that are that have potential health risks, where we use them consistently in high contact environments. The fact that these herbicides are used for, you know, lawn edging in parks to keep the grass off the edge of sandpits is just lunacy. The fact that these herbicides are used in our food production systems, and the same companies that are producing and selling these herbicides are the ones that are also developing the gene technology to make certain crop types more herbicide resistant. Now that's just lunacy. You know, when it comes to our home gardens, really the size and the scale that we're working on, there should be very little reason why we should ever have to use chemical products that can be poisonous or disruptive. It's just about good design and good management. And, you know, really, organic gardening is more than just choosing an organic product. Organic gardening is about, you know, understanding how things work together and use a combination of approaches. So what we call physical approaches, and that is how you can design things to exclude, for example, the idea of using netting or traps or barriers. You know, in the case of weeds, edging to stop running weeds get in. Smothering, you know, with thick newspaper and mulch is a physical approach. Then we use cultural approaches. And the term cultural refers to how we might change the management of what we do to reduce the likelihood of a particular outbreak. A cultural technique for managing weeds is slashing them before they flower and set seed. You know, something as simple as that dramatically reduces the problem you've got to deal with. And then only finally do you need to get in and do you know, any you know, particular spraying or what have you. And ideally that's done using something completely safe and natural.
Have you heard of the spray called slusher?
Yes.
Yeah. So what's your opinion on that one?
So we're talking slasher was the one with the acid-based active ingredient that I haven't seen the efficacy of how it works, as in how effective it is. I understand it needs to rely on certain conditions like, you know, hot weather, certain temperatures and the like to make sure that the plant actually gets stressed enough to die. So not having used it myself, I probably don't want to comment too much on it. But again, what I would always suggest is go back to those underlying principles of understanding the problem, what are the physical opportunities to deal with it through mechanical processes, again, smothering, physically slashing, what are the cultural practices being done by either weeding it out or cutting seed heads off before they spread, and then only finally using the products to follow up on. What a great question. What's happened to the Dalkeith House? It has been bulldozed and built over with a McMansion. Yeah. It was a predictable ending, wasn't it? It really was. Oh, what a lovely question. What a lovely question. This gentleman to my right asked, how did the old lady react when she came and saw the garden? She cried. Yeah, and I started to cry after that. I hope we'll see that was. It was really lovely. She couldn't believe it. And she took me on a garden tour of my garden because she knew where all the paths were, all those ones that I dug up. It was marvellous, and it was so rewarding to hear that. But yeah, she went and she told me about her husband and how he built the glass house, and you know, it's obviously brought back a whole lot of memories. It was really lovely. But yeah, look, unfortunately the house ended up getting redeveloped, and we always knew that, and it's kind of one of the reasons we had all this kind of like, you know, free license to do what we wanted to do. And what was interesting was that once we'd finished the garden and, you know, really we got that up and running, and there was always stuff to do, but we'd restored it all, and that was sorted. And we built stuff and all the rest of it. We started to renovate the house, and really, it was my first rental, so I never really quite knew what the kind of line in the sand was. Obviously, I'd stepped over it and it kept running. And I never forget because it's been managed by the local real estate agent who knew that the owners were elsewhere. As I said, as long as our rent was paid, they never came. They didn't have to worry about it. But at one point, the family who owned it, I said they lived overseas, Chinese family. They were thinking of selling it. They were going to be spending some time here in Australia for professional reasons, but things hadn't worked out. So they'd gone back to China. The thinking was that at some stage they were going to go back, and it was destined for the youngest daughter. But they were re-evaluating their options, and at one point it was potentially going to be sold. We were advised of this, and in fact their investment manager, so we've moved on from the real estate agent here, the investment manager who looked after their portfolio contacted us and said that he wanted to come and have a look and just see, because he's going through and evaluating all the assets, obviously very well for family. So we said sure. So he came and had a look, and he'd seen, I think he may well have been involved in the original purchase, I don't know. But he came and he just cracked up laughing. And he just said, he's looking around and saw this place and what we've done. And he just said, in any other situation, you would be strung up and quartered. But given that it all looks great and you've made it better, like, good on you. So he said, now we started to get grand ideas between us. I think maybe we can buy it. What do you reckon? So we got some advice on what it might be worth, and at that stage, we're all on student incomes, and we wouldn't have been able to scrap up a deposit, let alone service the loan or something like that. So we were just dreaming. Now, as it turned out, I had, when I came back from overseas, I spent a bit more time there, but I kind of felt it was time to move on. I started my postgrad studies down at Murdoch University, so I decided to move down to Fremantle. The main reason being that my girlfriend at the time had made it quite clear to me that, and now my wife I should say too, so it was the right decision. She said to me, look, if this is going to work between us, you've got to move to Fremantle. Of course I did. And one thing strong enough to pull me away from my garden was my very serious girlfriend and my wife. But what we did is, like, over the years, and obviously I started with Gardening Australia not long after that, for those who've been watching the show a long time, some of you may have seen that garden in Cersei Circle. Some of you may have visited it as the first organic and permaculture garden ever listed in what was then the Australian Open Garden Scheme. Right? We opened it twice under that scheme. It had always been the sort of the bastion of very traditional gardens, and you can actually see, the question was, is it on YouTube? If you want to see what that garden's like, you could probably the best way to see it is Gardening Australia have been doing this garden path series. You may have seen that. So the first one was done with me, and it actually went back and used some of the historical footage from that garden and shows me as a young guest on the show, skinny little boy with a big hairstyle. And my first attempt at presenting, because I had never done it before. And in fact, guess the bit they used on the show was me talking about rock minerals and how important it is to remineralise sandy soil. And that was back in 1998, so back before it was trendy. Again, it's based on the science of it all. But over the years, I fixed up a number of old gardens. So when I first got the show, and I thought, okay, here's a chance to do something interesting. And I've always seen Gardening Australia as an opportunity to share things that I'm very, very passionate about, gardening in particular, and ways to garden and what have you. So I rented the first garden I fixed up from scratch on Gardening Australia was a rental in Hilton. Belonged to Peter Dingle, who was one of my lecturers at the time at Murdoch, and he had bought it when he was a PhD student many years before, and since moved elsewhere in Fremantle. But he rented it and said, look, you can be here for as long as you like, and he'd already done lots of things in the garden. So I said, all right, I just started as a presenter on the show, and I said to the producers at the time, I said, here's an opportunity. I'm going to be fixing up the garden anyway because it's what I do. How about we'll follow it step by step? And they were like, oh, that sounds a bit ambitious. Let's see how you go. All right, so we'll do that. So I did the first story, which was the setup, which was the design. I said, here's the property, here's what we're going to do, and the feedback was so strong that the producer called me and said, right, we're going to double your filming schedule. Let's get stuck into this. I'm like, oh my God, right. So it was my first year as a presenter, first year of my PhD at that stage, on a pretty lean scholarship. And all of a sudden I've now made this commitment on national television. I'm going to fix this whole garden up with no money. Because believe it or not, the ABC, as wonderful as an employer as they are, they don't provide us with big budgets to do this stuff. So we've just got to do it. So basically that set up a process of I would do a shoot, I would get paid my presenter fee, and I would then use that to buy the materials for the next shoot. and I didn't even own the house. So it wasn't the wisest business move I've ever made, but thoroughly satisfying. And at that point, I really didn't mind. It was more about the opportunity and doing something. So over 2 years, we did a whole series of stories that fixed up this whole garden from scratch. And all the money I earned as presenter was sunk back into fixing it. Peter was quite supportive and kindly provided for some of the materials that he could see help improve the value of the property, or at least get things done that needed doing. And so as we got to the end, it was a bit of a sort of a bittersweet thing, because it was a wonderful project and it helped really establish me on the show as someone who liked to do things and practical things and getting stuff done, not just talking about it, which I've always felt was very important. But as we got towards the end of the garden, Peter's situations changed and he needed to sell the house pretty quickly. And he said, do you want to buy it? Guess what? The situation hadn't improved much from the Dalkeith one. Even though Hilton was a lot more modest than Dalkeith, but I was a PhD student on a scholarship that the banks don't even consider. And with a part-time ABC presenter's wage, so I could have maybe bought The Verge if it was for sale, and that was about it. So I had to say, look, no, I can't, unfortunately, but it had to be sold, and I was just about 6 months short of finishing the whole project off after over 2 years. I was like, oh. Plus, I've made this, at least in my eyes, this commitment on national television to see the whole thing through. I'd given this vision that this is what it's going to be like, and we were step by step, the fruit trees, the poultry, step by step. And as it turned out, my brother, my older brother, who had been living and working in Kalgoorlie with his young family, was ready to move back into Perth. So he said, look, we're ready to buy a house in Perth. How about we buy it? You can stay there and finish off your TV series on it. I had wanted to open the open garden scheme. He said you can open it, and then we'll move in. So I got to finish it, which was fantastic. It was at the end of the last story I did on it, which was we filmed the open garden visitation, and sort of got, because it had been quite a journey for the viewers watching it over that time. And I think it was the first time that Gardening Australia had done a whole series running, from a garden from scratch all the way through. When we finish it off, at the end, emotional, cheesy scene, handing the keys over to my brother, so to speak, out the front of his young family, and that was done. And then we literally moved out, and that was that. And people often say, well, wasn't that sad? Well, of course it was hard, but I didn't take anything with me. Like, I'm a big believer in this. I've since done 2 other gardens. Following that one, we moved straight into our little South Fremantle terrace that we rented from family friends. Same thing, they just fixed the house up, they were renting it out. The garden was a disaster, little terrace garden. And the opportunity there was, having done this big quarter-acre permaculture garden, the opportunity was to go, okay, well, let's see what we can do in a small space that was only a fraction of the size, going from a 900 square metre to a 300 square metre, 60 square metre garden, with limited access and what a lot of people are dealing with. So we said, right, well, let's do that. So we did a whole other series on that over 3 years. And built studio, deck, pergola, underground rainwater tanks, grey water systems, trellised fruit trees, all these things. And again, funny enough, just as I got to finish it off, the owners decided to move back in. So yeah, could you not? So we had to move on, and I thought, hang on, I'm beginning to spot a trend here. But we still weren't quite ready. My wife at the time, we got married in that garden actually. We got married and we were expecting our first child. She had just finished her PhD. I was still working part-time on mine. Started my consulting practice, still filming with Garden in Australia. We were probably a year or two away from being ready to be able to get our own place. So we found another rental just nearby, also in Fremantle, that belonged to friends of ours, or the parents of friends of ours.